They called him the Scourge of God, a man so feared that even Rome paid him to stay away. He united brutal tribes from the ends of the earth into a single, unstoppable force. He destroyed cities that had stood for centuries and shook the very foundations of empires. Attila became one of the most feared conquerors in human history, a name that still commands respect and terror. This is the story of Attila the Hun, a man of mystery, blood, and iron. To understand the man behind the myth, here are 15 essential facts about the legendary king of the Huns. Let's dive into the life of the man who brought Rome to its knees. Attila was born around 406 AD, emerging from the vast Central Asian steppes into a world of shifting borders and rising power. He wasn't born into a life of simple raiding, but into the very heart of the Hunnic ruling elite. His father was Munzuk, a powerful chieftain, and his uncles, Rugala and Oktar, were the kings who united the tribes. From the very first light of his life, Attila was groomed for a destiny of war, power, and conquest. In the Hunnic camps, life began in the saddle. It was said that Hunnic children learned to ride before they could even walk. As a young noble, Attila's daily life revolved around equestrian mastery, conducting almost every life function from the back of a horse. He was trained in the lethal art of the composite bow, a technological marvel that allowed a horseman to fire with deadly precision. But his education went beyond the physical. He learned the languages of his future enemies, Latin and Gothic. As part of noble hostage exchanges, he likely spent time in Roman courts, learning the very tactics he would one day use to dismantle them. He mastered the cunning strategies of the steppe, the feigned retreat, and the devastating ambush that struck terror into the legions. His world was a sophisticated tribal confederation, a portable city of yurts and wagons that could vanish in a single night. By the time he came of age, he was more than a warrior. He was a successor to a machine of war forged in the fire of his ancestors. The cradle of the Scourge of God was the wilderness itself, a land that recognized only strength and absolute loyalty. Before he shook the foundations of Rome, Attila was a child of the steppe, groomed to rule everything the light touched. In 434 AD, the death of King Rugila left a massive power vacuum. His nephews Attila and Bleda stepped forward as joint heirs to the Hunnic throne. Dual kingship was a tradition for the Huns, but this partnership would reshape the world. Together, they inherited an empire stretching from the Rhine to the Caspian Sea. Their first act was a display of absolute dominance. At the Treaty of Margus, they forced Roman ambassadors to negotiate entirely from horseback. The terms were humiliating for Rome. The annual tribute was doubled to 700 pounds of gold, and all Hunnic renegades were to be returned for execution. This steady flow of gold transformed Hunnic society, funding a professional military elite that even the legions could not match. While Bleda was known for his boisterous court and love of spectacle, Attila remained focused, calculating, and increasingly ambitious. In 441, when the Romans fell behind on payments, the brothers launched a devastating assault on the Balkans, sacking major cities along the frontier. Cities like Viminacium and Singadunum fell. The Huns proved they weren't just raiders, they were masters of high-stakes extortion and siege warfare. But as their power grew, so did the tension between the two brothers. The empire was too small for two scourges of God. In 445, the co-rule came to a sudden and violent end. Ancient sources claim that during a hunting trip, Bleda met a mysterious and likely orchestrated end. With Bleda gone, Attila became the sole autocrat. He consolidated the tribes and prepared for an even greater assault on the civilized world. The collaborative tribal confederacy was dead. In its place rose a monarchy built on blood, gold, and the absolute will of one man. The first decade of his reign was a shared venture, but the shadow that would darken Europe was Attila's alone. The rise of Attila was complete. The Scourge of God was ready to strike. For 11 years, Attila and his elder brother Bleda shared the throne of the Huns. But by 445 AD, the world had become too small for two kings. While Bleda favored diplomacy and the stability of the existing Roman treaties, Attila hungered for absolute expansion and total conquest. The end came during a royal hunting expedition. On the vast, lawless plains, a hunting trip provided the perfect cover for a high-stakes betrayal. Most ancient chroniclers are blunt. Bleda was assassinated. Whether by a stray arrow or a calculated plot, he vanished into the darkness of history. One legend claims Attila executed him near the city of Buda, casting his body into the river to ensure no rivals could ever find his grave. Attila moved with terrifying speed to consolidate power. He integrated Bleda's personal retinues and seized his vast wealth before a single tribe could revolt. The collaborative tribal confederacy was dead. In its place rose a monarchy built on the absolute will of one man. To solidify his divine right, he claimed the discovery of the Sword of Mars, a sacred relic that proved the gods had chosen him alone to rule the world. In Rome and Constantinople, the news was received with pure terror. Bleda's moderating influence was gone. The Scourge of God was now unchecked. Attila immediately transformed the state into a machine for total war. He tripled the demands on the Romans, demanding 2,100 pounds of gold every year. His first act as sole ruler was a devastating invasion that sacked 70 cities and crushed the imperial armies at the Battle of the Utus. He even purged his brother's court, gifting Bleda's favorite entertainers back to the Romans. Everything that reminded him of his brother's softness was erased. With the death of Bleda, the final internal check on Attila's power was gone. The path to the heart of Europe was open. Bleda was the last shared shadow. Now only the Scourge of God remained. Attila's empire was not a monolithic state, but a sophisticated multi-ethnic military mosaic. He united dozens of disparate tribes into a single, lethal confederation. He didn't just rule Huns. His ranks were filled with Goths, Alans, Rugians, and Gepids, turning former enemies into his most trusted subjects. Among his most loyal vassals was King Ardaric of the Gepids, a man so respected that Attila treated him more as a peer than a conquered king. The Ostrogoths provided the heavy cavalry led by the brothers of the Amali line, forming the devastating wings of the Hunnic war machine. To manage this melting pot, Attila created the Logades system. These picked men were a meritocratic elite chosen for their talent, regardless of their ethnic blood. The Logades were Attila's eyes and ears. They collected tribute, administered justice, and handled the high-stakes diplomacy with the Roman world. In the heart of the steppe, a linguistic melting pot emerged. Hunnic was the language of the elite, but Gothic, Latin, and Greek were the languages of power. His military genius lay in synergy. He synchronized the horse archer's agility with the heavy infantry's grit, creating a structured force unlike any Rome had seen. By 451 AD, he led a force estimated at up to 500,000 men, a portable city of warriors that could vanish and reappear in a single night. He even absorbed the technology of those he conquered, utilizing captive engineers to build Roman-style siege engines that razed fortified cities. The Sword of Mars became the ultimate unifying symbol. It provided the spiritual justification for his absolute rule over all tribes. Attila didn't just lead a tribe, he commanded a world. He proved that under the absolute will of one man, even the most bitter rivals could become a single sword. The Scourge of God was ready, and the heart of Europe was now in his sights. By 447 AD, the Eastern Roman Empire was on the brink of collapse. Attila's shadow loomed over the very walls of Constantinople, leaving the emperor with only one way to survive. Fear dictated Roman policy. Emperor Theodosius II was forced to negotiate the most expensive and humiliating peace in imperial history. The terms were staggering. Attila demanded a lump sum of 6,000 pounds of gold in arrears and tripled the annual tribute to 2,100 pounds. 6,000 pounds of gold, nearly 2 metric tons, was delivered as a punishment for previous failures to pay. It was a weight that nearly bankrupted the treasury. To raise the gold, Rome turned on its own. Imperial properties were auctioned, and the senatorial class was taxed into poverty to satisfy Attila's greed. It wasn't just tribute. The ransom for Roman prisoners was raised to 12 solidi per head, creating a lucrative kidnap and ransom economy that further drained the empire. In 448, the chronicler Priscus visited Attila's court. He found a king who toyed with Roman envoys, fully aware of a clumsy assassination plot the Romans had launched against him. Priscus observed Attila's strategic discipline. While his lieutenants flaunted their gold, Attila lived with barbarian simplicity, a calculated image that terrified the decadent Romans. The payments finally stopped in 450 AD. The new emperor, Marcian, famously declared, "I have gold for my friends and steel for my enemies." Marcian's defiance shifted Attila's wrath. With the East no longer paying, the Scourge of God turned his sights toward the unsuspecting lands of the West. The tribute had bought Rome time, but that time had run out. Attila was now coming for everything else. But in the world of Attila, peace was never a destination. It was merely a tactical pause. By 441 AD, the treaties that bound the Huns and Romans began to burn. Attila was a master of political pretexts. He accused the Romans of harboring Hunnic renegades, nobles who had fled his rise to power and could challenge his throne. But the ultimate insult was spiritual. Attila claimed a Roman bishop had crossed the Danube to rob and desecrate the sacred tombs of Hunnic royalty. For Attila, this wasn't just a grievance. It was the moral justification he needed to launch a campaign of total annihilation against the empire. The drums of war began to thunder across the steppe. Attila recognized that Rome's best legions were thousands of miles away, fighting in Africa. He sensed a vacuum of power. With the Danubian frontier stripped of its defenders, the Scourge of God saw an empire ripe for the taking. He struck with terrifying precision. The border fortresses fell in days, and the marketplace where Romans and Huns once traded became a slaughterhouse. This was not a simple raid. It was a systematic dismantling of the Balkans. Over 70 cities were razed to the ground to ensure Rome would never feel secure again. War was the engine of Attila's economy. He needed constant Roman loot to satisfy his subordinate kings and maintain the fragile loyalty of his multi-ethnic host. In 447, nature itself seemed to aid him. Massive earthquakes shattered the walls of Constantinople, leaving the imperial capital defenseless before his approach. He crushed the last imperial field army at the Battle of the Utus. The path to the heart of the empire was now paved with the bodies of Rome's finest. Attila didn't just break the peace, he shattered the Roman world's sense of security. The time for tribute was over, the time for total conquest had begun. The treaties were ash. The Scourge of God was now truly unchecked. In 441 AD, the frontier collapsed. With Rome's legions fighting thousands of miles away, Attila and Bleda launched a strike that would turn the Balkans into a wasteland. The Huns were no longer just raiders of the open plain. They had evolved, absorbing captive engineers to master the one thing that had once stopped them, the Roman wall. At Nisus, the birthplace of Constantine, the Huns unleashed their new terror. Massive battering rams and rolling towers dismantled defenses the Romans thought were impregnable. One by one, the vital military hubs of the frontier were razed. The social and economic fabric of the Balkans was being shredded by an unmatched war machine. The chronicler Priscus described a scene of absolute desolation. Years later, the riverbanks remained white with the bleached bones of those who stood in Attila's path. Priscus found Nisus a ghost city. It was so ruined that the Roman embassy had to camp in the fields. The stench of death within the walls was still too much to bear. In 447, Attila returned as sole ruler. This was no longer an invasion. It was a systematic extermination of Roman presence in the region. Over 70 cities were sacked and burned. From the Danube to the pass of Thermopylae, the Scourge of God left nothing but embers and silence. Tens of thousands fled. Farmers, nobles, and soldiers abandoned their lands, pouring into the slums of Constantinople in a desperate bid for survival. The peace that followed was a graveyard. Rome was forced to create a 100-mile no-man's land south of the Danube, a desolate buffer zone where life was forbidden. The wealth of the Balkans was drained. Roman families went bankrupt, paying ransoms for loved ones lost in the shadow of the steppe. Attila had not just defeated Rome's armies, he had broken its spirit. The Danubian frontier would not recover for nearly a millennium. The Balkans were only the beginning. With the east broken, the Scourge of God was now ready to look west, toward the heart of the Roman world. The fire of the steppe was spreading, and Gaul was next. He was known as the Scourge of God. Attila the Hun didn't just lead an army, he commanded a force that redefined warfare in the 5th century. From the steppes of Central Asia, his empire stretched from the Rhine to the Caspian Sea, striking terror into the hearts of both Romans and barbarians. Attila was more than a conqueror. He was a master diplomat and a ruthless strategist who knew exactly how to exploit the weaknesses of a crumbling Rome. The secret to their success? Technological superiority. Their composite bows could outrange and outpenetrate almost anything the Western world had seen. But weapons were only half the story. The Huns were born in the saddle, creating a bond between man and beast that made them nearly unstoppable. From childhood, they lived, ate, and even slept on horseback. By the time they reached the battlefield, they were one with their mounts. This brings us to the core of their military might. Let's look at why they were the undisputed masters of the horse. The Huns fought on horseback, fast, aggressive, precise. Their speed made them deadly. They could strike and vanish before the enemy even realized they were under attack. Their most lethal trick was the fake retreat. They would run away, drawing the enemy into a pursuit, only to turn around and unleash a hail of arrows. This psychological warfare broke the discipline of the most seasoned Roman legions, turning organized defense into a slaughter. Rome was so terrified that they paid thousands of pounds of gold in tribute every year just to buy a temporary and fragile peace. It all culminated at the Catalonian Plains, a titanic clash that decided the fate of Western civilization and checked the Hunnic tide. When Attila died in 453, his empire died with him, but the memory of his horsemen would haunt Europe for centuries. Attila the Hun, a name synonymous with power, speed, and the sheer terror of the steppes. In the year 451 AD, the Scourge of God, Attila, turned his eyes toward the west. Gaul, the heart of the Roman Empire's power in the north, was his next target. Attila commanded a vast coalition of Germanic and Eurasian tribes, a force so massive that contemporary chroniclers claimed the earth itself seemed to tremble beneath their march. Known for their unparalleled skill in horse archery and swift maneuvers, the Huns were the most feared warriors of the ancient world, crossing the Rhine with unstoppable momentum. Major cities like Metz and Reims fell to the Hunnic fury. The invasion was swift and brutal, leaving a trail of devastation that sent shockwaves all the way to Rome. Panic gripped the empire. For centuries, Gaul had been a bastion of Roman civilization, but now it faced an existential threat unlike any before it. Attila laid siege to the strategic city of Orleans. Its fall would mean the total collapse of Roman control in central Gaul. Time was running out. The Roman general Flavius Aetius, a man who had once lived among the Huns and understood their ways, realized that Rome could not win this fight alone. In a masterstroke of diplomacy, Aetius forged a desperate alliance with his former rivals, the Visigoths, convincing King Theodoric that Attila was a threat to all. The combined Roman and Visigothic forces marched to meet Attila. The two sides finally collided on the Catalonian plains in one of history's most pivotal battles. The fighting was savage and chaotic. Hundreds of thousands of men were locked in a struggle that would decide the fate of Western Europe for centuries to come. King Theodoric of the Visigoths fell in the fray, but his death only fueled his people's rage, leading them to push back against the Hunnic lines with renewed ferocity. For the first time, Attila's aura of invincibility was shattered. Realizing the tide had turned, he ordered a withdrawal, retreating back toward the Danube. The invasion of Gaul was over. While Attila remained a threat, the Battle of the Catalonian Plains ensured that Gaul and the future of the West would not be Hunnic. In the year 451 AD, the Western world held its breath. At the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, Attila the Hun faced a Roman alliance in a clash of civilizations. The Scourge of God had carved a path of destruction across the continent. But here, in the fields of Gaul, his unstoppable tide would meet its greatest challenge. General Aetius had gathered a desperate coalition, uniting Romans and Visigoths against a common terrifying enemy. Opposing them were the Huns, masters of the steppe, whose lightning-fast cavalry and deadly archery had humbled empires. It became one of the largest and most consequential battles of late antiquity, a struggle for the very future of Europe. The clash was titanic. Thousands of men and horses collided in a cacophony of iron and bone that could be heard for miles. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance. The plains were soaked in blood as both sides fought with a ferocity born of desperation. Attila personally led his elite warriors into the thick of the fray, his presence driving his men to even greater heights of violence. But the Roman alliance held. A decisive charge by the Visigoths finally managed to breach the Hunnic lines, turning the tide of the massacre. As night fell, Attila withdrew to his camp, surrounded by wagons, preparing for a final stand that would never come. Though technically a draw, the battle was a strategic victory for Rome. Attila's dream of total European conquest had been shattered. The great battle ended, but the legends of Attila and the plains of Gaul would echo through history for over a millennium. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains had ended in a bloody stalemate. For the first time in his legendary career, Attila the Hun was forced to retreat. He withdrew his forces into the shelter of a wagon lager, a massive wooden fortress on the edge of the battlefield, preparing for a Roman assault that never came. The night was thick with the smoke of fires and the groans of the wounded. But the Huns were a people forged in the fires of the steppe. They did not break easily. Inside his tent, Attila sat amidst his generals. His eyes were not on the losses of the day, but on the campaigns of tomorrow. To him, this was but a pause in his destiny. His army survived, and his power remained strong. The Roman alliance was a fragile thing, held together only by a common, desperate fear of the Huns. By dawn, the great king had begun the long march back to his heartlands. His army was not a defeated rabble, but a coiled spring, ready to strike again at the first sign of weakness. General Aetius watched them go from the heights, knowing his victory was hollow. The beast had been wounded, yes, but it was far from dead. Rome's respite would be brief. Attila's reach still spanned from the Rhine to the Caspian Sea. His name alone continued to strike terror into the hearts of kings and commoners alike. The war was not over. In his mind, Attila was already planning his return to Italy, a campaign that would be even more vengeful and dangerous than the last. Defeat is often just the prelude to a greater storm. For the Western Roman Empire, the worst of Attila the Hun was yet to come. The story of survival is often more terrifying than the story of conquest. In 452 AD, just 1 year after his retreat from Gaul, Attila turned his gaze south. He led his reinvigorated army across the Alps and invaded Italy, the heart of the Roman world. The mountains were no barrier to his ambition. The Huns poured through the passes like a mountain torrent, catching the Roman defenders completely off guard. Aquileia, the pride of the northeast, was the first to fall. After a brutal 3-month siege, it was so thoroughly destroyed that it was said a man could not even find its ruins. City after city, Milan, Padua, Verona, fell before him. The Huns moved with a speed that defied belief, leaving a trail of ash and desolation across the Po Valley. As the Huns marched south, a wave of pure terror swept toward the capital. Rome, once the master of the world, now trembled at the mere mention of Attila's name. Rome feared what would come next. The imperial government was in shambles, and the legendary legions that had once conquered continents were nowhere to be found. In a desperate move, Emperor Valentinian III sent a diplomatic mission led by Pope Leo I. They sought to meet the Scourge of God on the banks of the Mincio River. The details of their meeting are lost to legend. Some say a vision of saints appeared to Attila. Others claim Leo offered a massive tribute and spoke of the plague ravaging the Hunnic ranks. Whatever the reason, the miracle happened. Attila halted his advance and withdrew from Italy. Rome was spared, but the scars of the invasion would never truly heal. Italy had been bled white. This would be Attila's last great campaign, a final display of the power that had brought an empire to its knees. The saga of the Huns remains one of history's most terrifying chapters. With the Roman army in disarray and the gates of the Eternal City wide open, the fate of the Western world rested on a single, unarmed man. Pope Leo I was Rome's last hope. In the summer of 452 AD, the Roman delegation traveled north. They reached the banks of the Mincio River, where the Scourge of God had halted his advance to await them. It was a moment of unprecedented bravery. A spiritual leader, carrying no weapons but his faith, walking into the heart of the most feared military camp in history. On the riverbank, the encounter finally happened. Pope Leo I met Attila. The two men represented the collision of two entirely different worlds, the dying classical empire and the rising power of the East. For a long time, there was only silence. The diplomatic tension was palpable as the Hunnic warriors watched their king, waiting for a signal that could mean life or death for Rome. In this silent confrontation, no words were recorded. Legend says that Attila saw a vision of Saints Peter and Paul standing behind the Pope, threatening him with drawn swords. Suddenly, the great king gave the order. He commanded his army to pack their tents and turn their horses north. To the shock of the world, Attila withdrew. The immediate threat to Rome had vanished. The Huns left Italy as quickly as they had arrived, leaving the Roman people to wonder at their narrow escape. Was it the Pope's words, a divine vision, or the reality of the plague and famine in his ranks? The reason remains a mystery, one of history's most fascinating what-ifs. Some victories are won with the sword, others with the spirit. By 453 AD, Attila the Hun was the most feared man in the known world. His empire stretched from the steppes of Asia to the heart of Europe. But his end would come not on a battlefield, but in his own bed. The bride was a young woman named Ildiko. It was a union that was meant to solidify his power, but fate had other plans. That same night, the celebration would turn to tragedy. The bride was a young woman named Ildiko. It was a union that was meant to solidify his power, but fate had other plans. That same night, the celebration would turn to tragedy. As the feast ended, Attila withdrew to his royal tent with his new bride. He was a man of legendary strength at the height of his health. No one could have predicted that he had but hours to live. The royal tent was silent. Outside, the camp slept, unaware that the great king was facing his final moments in a sudden, violent struggle with his own mortality. The next morning, his guards became concerned by the silence. When they finally broke into the tent, they found a sight that would change history. Attila was dead. Suddenly, the Scourge of God lay in a pool of his own blood. It appeared he had suffered a massive internal hemorrhage, choking to death while in a deep, wine-induced sleep. The Huns mourned their king with a ferocity that matched their warfare. They cut their hair and gashed their faces so that the greatest warrior should be lamented not with women's tears, but with the blood of men. He was buried in a secret location, encased in coffins of gold, silver, and iron. To keep the spot hidden, all those who participated in the burial were executed. With Attila's sudden death, the Hunnic Empire began to crumble. Without his singular will to hold it together, the barbarian tide that had threatened Rome finally receded into the shadows of history. The mystery of Attila's end remains one of history's most sudden conclusions. The news of Attila's death spread like wildfire. The man who had held the fate of millions in his hand was gone, and with him, the glue that held the Hunnic Empire together. At its peak, the empire was a vast mosaic of conquered tribes and tributary states, stretching from the Rhine to the borders of China. But Attila had left no clear successor. His many sons immediately began to quarrel, dividing the inheritance and weakening the unified front that had once terrified the world. The subject nations, seeing their chance, rose in rebellion. The tribes that were once forced to serve the Huns now turned their blades against their masters. The end came at the Battle of Nidau in 454 AD. The Huns were decisively defeated by a coalition of their former subjects, marking the permanent loss of their dominance. Within just a few years of his death, the Hunnic Empire had effectively vanished. Without the singular, terrifying will of Attila, the nomadic power could not survive. The royal courts fell silent, the great wooden palaces were abandoned, and the golden throne of the Huns was broken and forgotten. The vast armies dissipated back into the eastern plains, leaving behind only the scars of their passage and a landscape reclaimed by silence. The Huns as a political entity were no more, but their legend remained. Attila became a figure of myth, a cautionary tale of power and destruction that would endure for centuries. He remains one of history's most enigmatic figures, a barbarian king who humbled emperors. The shadow of the Huns had passed, but the legend of Attila would endure forever. Thank you for joining us for this epic journey through the life of Attila. History is written by those who survive the storm.